Hi, I'm here today with Rob Harrison. He's an architect here in Seattle and also a housing advocate. And I'm going to ask him a few questions about Seattle and single family zoning and how it impacts the lives of people here and people who want to live here. Hi, Rob. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for asking me.
So I thought we could start out with talking about single family zoning, the history of it, and how it came to be the way it is.
Well, prior to 1923, there was actually no zoning designation for single family. It was just called residential. And that zoning included the possibility of duplexes, triplexes, corner stores, small apartment buildings, and it was really determined by construction type rather than, and to a certain extent height, rather than use. And then in 1923, the first sort of more restrictive zoning was passed in Seattle that eliminated some of those possibilities.
So, so what were some of the reasons why they changed zoning after 23?
Well, I think that right around that time there was a movement away from strict covenants in land that prevented people of color from buying houses in certain areas, and zoning was kind of a substitute way to maintain that exclusivity.
So I was kind of assumed that people of color would be low income, and if you had single family housing in a certain area, that would make it impossible for them to move into that area.
Because single family housing was more expensive than multifamily.
Right. And before 1923, so in those neighborhoods such as Wallingford, were they putting in, I assume they still have a legacy of that. There's still some of that kind of building there where you'd have a corner store or small apartment buildings interspersed with single family neighborhoods.
Yeah, in fact, the block that I lived on when I first moved to Seattle was exactly like that. I lived in a duplex, and across the street from me was an affordable small apartment building. A lot of UW students lived there. Down the street were basement apartments and backyard cottages and single-family houses all mixed together.
So now today we have a lot of single-family zoned areas. Tell me more about what's the percentage here in Seattle?
Well, if you look at the percentage of the entire city, it's about 66%. If you look at the percentage of the parcels on which housing can actually be built, single-family zoning is about 80% of the available parcels.
So a vast majority of the zoning here is single-family,
yes, leaving
a very small area to increase housing. And now that Seattle is such in demand and so many corporations have moved here and housing has become scarce, we need to have some multifamily housing. So explain how having that much zone for single family is a problem for creating housing.
Well, one of the aspects is that in the last several years, I think maybe 5 years, about 94% of the new housing units that have been created have been in the multifamily zones, which are only 16% of all of Seattle. And only about 5% in the single-family zones. So, in fact, the single-family zones are losing population compared to where they were.
Does that mean there's not enough people who can afford to live in them?
Well, it's a combination of that people are getting older and their children are moving out, and it's just people living there in their big old house by themselves. So
how would changing the zoning from single family to allow multifamily housing, affordable housing, why is single family zoning the best way to make that happen?
Well, changing single-family zoning would be a way to, well, a couple things would happen. One is that you would lessen the difference between the areas that are currently zoned multifamily along arterials, which tend to allow buildings that are 40 to 60 feet tall, 65 feet tall, and the single-family houses, which are now the maximum of 30 feet tall. So there's a big jump between the arterials, the parcels along the arterials, and the next parcels, which are single family. If you spread that out a little bit, the transition would be gentler. And
meaning, when you say spread out among the urban villages instead of just
spread out in the areas that are now currently zoned single family.
Oh, okay.
So that you would make it possible in those areas to build small apartment buildings, corner stores, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes even, that are roughly the same size as a current single family house.
So why do you feel like it's necessary that we have multifamily housing? I mean, how has this impacted people of middle to lower incomes?
Well, single family houses in Seattle right now are, I think the median price is over $800,000. So, and approximately 25% of single family homes are owned outright. The people living in them don't have mortgages. That's a real barrier to entry for anyone who would like to live in a single family zone. The single family zones are also areas of high opportunity. In other words, they are the areas that are in many neighborhoods are closest to parks, closest to schools, closest to libraries.
And the urban villages like Wallingford are the close-in neighborhoods that are just right outside the city, the downtown part of the city. So increased density would make it possible for people to have a more walkable area. If there were more retail possibilities.
Yeah, you could send your kid to the corner store instead of getting in your car or even getting on your bicycle and riding to the larger grocery store.
So I know you've been here in Seattle for a long time, so you have your own little example from your personal example of how, when people can't afford to purchase homes, they've got to rent. And since it's so hard rental properties are so scarce as well around here, the rents have really increased dramatically. So maybe you could tell us about how, as you went from being a homeowner to an apartment renter and how that impacted you.
Well, of course, my particular story is still one of privilege. I mean, because I'm white and a professional, is definitely my story is more.
Don't have to apologize for your story. It's your story.
All right. Well.
So what was your mortgage when you were in your home?
So my ex-wife and I owned a 2,600 square foot house with a garage, a separate garage, and it also actually had a basement apartment which we rented out. So our mortgage was about $1,600 a month, and we rented the apartment for about $850 a month. So our housing expense was about $850 a month for a 2,600 square foot house.
3-bedroom house, yeah.
After we got divorced, neither one of us could afford to buy the other out, and so we had to sell the house. Now I live in a 800 square foot apartment. Two-bedroom apartment for which I pay $2,400 a month.
Which is
and my ex also lives in a two-bedroom apartment for which she pays about $2,000 a month because she's farther out than I am. So our costs, our housing costs have gone up like 5 times from what they were.
Right. So having rents.
There's one other thing,
sure.
And that is that neither one of us were able to stay in the neighborhood that we lived in because there were no affordable apartments in that neighborhood in Mount Baker.
And that impacted where your son might go to school.
Well, it impacted his friends and
right.
his community and also our community, our friends.
Right. So I mean, as you say, you are more privileged than some, but so we can only imagine that how cost burdened many people who have to rent are here because the rents are so high, higher than often mortgage for a home is.
Yep.
And so say that the rezoning is done and you can start to build multifamily housing, upzone Wallingford, add apartment buildings and retail space. how would that tell the Wallingford residents how that would look and work, and why they shouldn't be afraid of it?
Well, I think that the biggest thing is that the neighborhoods, the close-in neighborhoods that people have the most affection for in Seattle are neighborhoods that were built before 1923. And so they have already this mix of building types and, you know, housing and small corner stores and things like that, with apartments above them. And so it's really not dramatically changing what's there already. It's really just kind of allowing what had been there before restrictive covenants and restrictive zoning was put in place to flourish again.
Well, how, if you were looking at like a, you know, several block radius, how would that look like? How, you know, as far as like describe, like you're walking down the street, what might people see, and why? You know, for instance, I can imagine that there'd be, you know, maybe there'd be some single family homes in the center, but maybe across the street might be a small apartment building, and then on some of the bigger corners there might be a retail store on the bottom level and apartments above,
or a restaurant or something,
like that.
I mean, I think that one of the things to keep in mind is that change is really slow. So even if the zoning was changed tomorrow, it would probably be 50 years before there was anything really significantly different about the block that you lived on. Change would be very slow because unlike now, where all of the house build or the home unit building is confined to a really small area of the city. If you changed all the single family zoning, then all that growth could be absorbed over a much wider area, and so the individual impact on your block would be probably much smaller.
So talk about a little bit why. So if it's a slow change process, how is it going to make things different? Is we just have to look at this as a slow process moving towards making Seattle more inclusive?
Well, it's a slow process that happens over a much wider area. So
so a greater impact, because it's not just in these little small, already zoned for multifamily housing,
which is
in the center of the city.
Yeah, or along an arterial. The other issue is that you know, arterials are noisier. There's more particulates. They're less healthy for children. There's more car traffic now, and that's more dangerous for pedestrians and bicyclists. So again, spreading this out over a larger portion of the city would be a good thing for those issues.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about some alternative solutions that have been proposed by people who are, you know, mostly in single-family zone areas, and they don't want to change the zoning where they are. So one of the ones that have been mentioned is building only in the areas that are zoned. We talked a little bit about that. So some people seem to think there's enough space available in the city to meet the need eventually. Why is that not true?
Well, the city did a capacity analysis of it, what they call it, and to sort of say, you know, if all of the buildings that could be made multifamily were, or all the parcels rather, if the buildings that were on them now were torn down and new buildings were built to the maximum zoning capacity, you know, how many units could be created? And the problem with that is that it's really subject to a lot of variation of changes in the economic climate. Sometimes people just don't want to sell, and they like the building that they're living in, and they don't want to change that. So it's, I think the capacity argument is one that does not really bear out in practical terms. The other thing is that again, if you change single-family zoning, you can have the capacity can happen in smaller increments, so that like instead of like a large corporate entity assembling 8 or 10 lots together to build a giant apartment building, you have, you know, individual mom and pop, you know, people building housing, and might be someone who, you know, has lived on the block for a long time. Their house needs a lot of repair. They decide, well, you know, we could build a 4-unit apartment building and live in one of the apartments and rent out the other ones and subsidize our retirement instead of holding on to the falling down house.
Right. So my last question is, so the other thing that people suggest is do nothing. This is the way we think it should be, and this is the way we want it to stay. And you know, if people are priced out and they need to live somewhere else, how, like, if you could sum up, like, how do you think that impacts Seattle and people of Seattle as a whole,
well,
from a moral and ethical and just a lifestyle situation?
Well, I think one of the interesting things, phrases that I've heard is, you know, that a lot of people who are opposed to changing the zoning, and I also want to emphasize that currently in Seattle, the portion of single-family zoning that we're talking about changing is only 6% of the entire, you know, 80% of Seattle. That it's only 6% of that we're talking about making a slightly more dense increment. So it's not really very
like
much.
Taking it all.
It's not really sort of rezoning the whole city. But if you do nothing, then what will happen is that single-family houses will continue to be completely unaffordable to people living in Seattle, and
people have to move out of the city and long
people
commutes,
will have to move out of the city, and then that means they'll probably end up driving, in which, you know, affects our carbon footprint. And you know, generally what you have in effect is you create like a gated community, and the other thing is that the doing nothing basically is what got us into this situation that we're in right now. So imagining that we can continue to do nothing and have that somehow be better than the situation that we're in now is like kind of the definition of crazy.
And Seattle's always been known as a place where there's a lot of culture and art, and a lot of funkiness and artistic and music center, and a place of creativity. Typically, a lot of those professions are not highly paid.
Right.
So, I mean, we could end up, do you think, I mean, the demographic here could end up being, you know, wealthy people and tech people, and nothing wrong with those people, but wouldn't it be nice to have
entirely
variety?
Possible. I mean, I think one of the things I really like is, you know, the idea is that what we want to preserve are neighborhood characters rather than neighborhood character. I mean, it's the neighborhood characters who are living there who actually make the neighborhood interesting,
right?
Rather than, you know, the specific.
I mean, you know, if you have a little pho restaurant somewhere, family run, and they have to drive for an hour outside the city, I mean, then they're not really a part of your community in the way that they would be
if they
could
live above the restaurant or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Rob Harrison.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it.